They for refusing my parents' wedding contract after an empty chair revealed where the money went? I'm Mia, 29, and I grew up as Blake's younger sister in the kind of family where that explanation usually came before anything else about me. Blake was 5 years older, louder, more confident, and somehow always standing in better light. When he got good grades, Dad said he was disciplined. When I got better grades, Mom said I had always been the academic one, as if that made it less impressive. When Blake forgot birthdays, he was busy. When I missed one Sunday dinner because I had the flu, I was pulling away from the family. By the time I got engaged to Daniel, I had learned to smile through comparisons before anyone else noticed they were happening. Daniel noticed anyway. He is 30, patient and almost aggressively calm, especially when paperwork is involved. He reads vendor emails twice before answering. I make coffee, rewrite the guest list at midnight, and pretend I'm not stressed until I start alphabetizing thank you cards that haven't even been written yet. We wanted a small wedding by our family's standards. About 80 guests, a warm dinner, a simple ceremony, and a reception where we could actually speak to the people we invited. No 6-tier cake. No fireworks. Number 12-piece band. No performance designed to prove we had spent enough money to deserve congratulations. We're not trying to make a statement, Daniel said one night as he circled 3 duplicate names on our guest list. I know. We're trying to have a wedding. I know. He looked at the stack of place card samples spread across our table. You're alphabetizing things again. That is unrelated. He smiled and handed me my coffee. The problem was that my parents didn't see a wedding as a private celebration. They saw it as a family production, and they had already produced one masterpiece. Blake and Kelsey's wedding had been treated like a royal event. My father, Richard, paid for a large venue, upgraded flowers, a photographer whose deposit cost more than our entire catering budget, a premium open bar, a polished rehearsal dinner, and part of their honeymoon. Every time the price increased, Dad called it an investment in family memories. When Blake wanted an extra hour added to the bar package, Dad approved it. When Kelsey decided the original centerpieces looked flat, Mom found money for suspended floral installations. When their rehearsal dinner guest list grew by 30 people, nobody asked them to cut back. Dad told everyone, "You only get one chance to do this properly." The final total was $154,000. I knew because Dad announced it during a holiday dinner as proof that he had given his son the wedding he deserved. At the time, I had been genuinely happy for Blake. I helped assemble welcome bags. I fixed Kelsey's veil when one of the pins came loose. I spent half the reception locating an uncle who had wandered away before family photos. But even then I noticed something. Nobody asked Blake to be reasonable. They asked everyone else to admire him. Daniel proposed 2 years later. The morning after we told my parents, Mom called and said, "We need to start discussing what kind of wedding makes sense. Not what we wanted. What made sense." Her version of helping began with small comments. The dress I liked was pretty, but maybe too plain for photographs. The dinner menu was comfortable, but not elegant. Our guest list was a little thin on important people. First I answered politely, "We like the dress. The food tastes good. We want people we actually know." Mom would pause, then say, "Of course. I only want what's best for you." A week later, she emailed me 27 names she wanted added to the guest list. Some were distant relatives I hadn't seen since childhood. Others were people from my father's professional and social circles whom I had never met. I called her. "Mom, we don't have room for these people. You have room if you adjust the tables. We have a venue limit. Your father knows the venue manager. That doesn't change the fire code." She gave a small laugh like I was being cute. "Mia, weddings always change. You don't need to lock everything down so early." 2 days after that conversation, our planner forwarded me an email. "Hi Mia. Just confirming whether you approved Richard's request for upgraded linens, a larger head table, and revised bar pricing. Since your contract lists you and Daniel as the decision makers, I have not made any changes." I stared at the message for a full minute. Then I forwarded it to Daniel. He called from work. "Did your dad ask you first?" "No." "Do you want me to respond?" "No. I'll do it." That was important to me. Daniel never tried to rescue me from my family. He didn't turn every insult into a speech about protecting me. He asked what I wanted, then stood beside me while I did it. I called Dad. He answered with, "I was going to call you. You contacted our planner. I asked a few questions. You requested changes. I asked what upgrades were available. There's a difference. You asked for a larger head table. There will be people who expect to sit with the family. The seating chart isn't finished." Exactly. I'm helping before you make choices that become difficult to reverse. I gripped the edge of the counter. Do not contact our vendors again. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You're getting very territorial about a wedding you haven't paid for yet." That sentence stayed with me. At that point, my parents hadn't given us $1. They had talked about helping. Mom had mentioned a meaningful contribution. Dad had said we shouldn't sign final contracts until the family discussed the budget. But they hadn't paid a deposit, reserved a vendor, or transferred money. Still in his mind, the wedding already belonged to him. A week later, my parents invited Daniel and me to dinner. Blake and Kelsey were there when we arrived. That should have warned me. Mom had made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and the same dinner rolls she served whenever she wanted the evening to feel traditional. Dad poured wine. Blake talked about a home renovation. Kelsey complimented Mom's centerpiece twice. Nobody mentioned the wedding until dessert. Then Dad wiped his mouth, reached down beside his chair, and placed a stapled packet on the table. The first page said, "Wedding Funding Agreement. Contribution $12,000. There were 19 numbered clauses. Dad had initialed the bottom corner of each page. For a moment, I honestly thought it was a joke. Then I started reading. My parents would be listed as hosts on the invitations. They would approve the final guest list. They could add up to 30 guests. They would approve the menu, photographer, music selections, flowers, ceremony wording, dress, reception timeline, and seating chart. Blake would give a speech. Dad would approve the order of toasts. Mom would have final approval over family photographs. An aunt who had defended me during an old family argument was not to be invited because her presence would create discomfort. My parents would sit at the honor table. Any disagreement regarding the use of funds would be decided by Dad because he was the contributor. Clause 19 said that accepting any portion of the $12,000 meant accepting the entire agreement. I read that sentence twice. Daniel sat beside me without touching the pages. Mom smiled too brightly. "It just keeps everyone on the same page." "This is a contract," I said. "It's an understanding," Dad corrected. "It says agreement at the top." Because informal arrangements create confusion. I looked at Blake. "Did you sign one of these?" He looked down at his plate. Dad answered for him. "Your brother trusted the family. Did he sign anything?" "That's not relevant." "It seems relevant." Kelsey leaned back. "Blake and I included your parents because we appreciated what they were doing." I turned another page. "You approved her dress?" Mom's mouth tightened. Kelsey valued my opinion. "Did Dad decide their guest list?" Blake finally looked at me. "You're acting like they owe you the same thing." The room went still. I hadn't asked for the same wedding. I had never asked for $154,000. Daniel and I had created a budget we could manage with some adjustments in time. What I wanted was to be treated like an adult instead of a project. "No," I said. "I'm asking why love has paperwork only when it's for me." Mom smoothed her napkin over her lap. "Money isn't the issue, Mia. Your attitude is." Dad tapped the packet with one finger. "Either you let us help properly, or you can pay for your little wedding yourself." There it was. Little wedding. Not smaller. Not ours. Little. I looked at Daniel. He gave me one small nod. "You decide." I slid the packet across the table. "I'm not accepting money that comes with ownership." Mom blinked. "Don't be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic. You haven't even discussed the rules." I read them. "You could negotiate," Kelsey said. "No, I'm not negotiating control of my own wedding." Dad's face hardened. "Then you can pay for it." "We will," Daniel said quietly. It was the only thing he said all evening. We left before coffee. In the car, I held myself together until Daniel pulled away from the curb. Then I said, $12,000. I know. 19 rules. I know. They spent more than that on Blake's flowers. I know. I turned toward the window. I don't want to lose my parents over a wedding. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. Then don't make the decision about the wedding. What does that mean? Make it about whether they get to control you with money. The wedding is just where they tried it. That night we reopened our budget. We cut the late-night snack station. We chose the less expensive photography package. We reduced the floral order and kept the flowers that mattered most. Daniel moved part of his savings. I paid the next venue deposit myself and saved the receipt in a folder on my laptop. The next morning I emailed every vendor. Only Mia and Daniel are authorized to approve changes, additions, upgrades, cancellations, guest count revisions, or payment arrangements. Please disregard instructions from any other person unless we confirm them in writing. Our planner replied within an hour. Confirmed. I have added a password to your account and noted both files. No changes will be made without written approval from you or Daniel. I felt ridiculous for being relieved by an email, but I was. For the first time since getting engaged, the wedding felt like ours again. That feeling lasted about 6 hours. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone started vibrating. An uncle left a voicemail saying family support should not be thrown back in people's faces. A cousin texted that Daniel should not isolate me from my parents. Aunt Rose, my mother's younger sister, called and left a message. Mia, I think you owe your parents a conversation. They're heartbroken. Your father says he offered to help, and you humiliated him in front of everyone. By evening, Dad had sent a family email titled, A Difficult Family Situation. He wrote that he and Mom had offered generous financial support, that I had rejected them, and that Daniel and I were excluding my parents from the wedding process. He didn't mention the 19 rules. He didn't mention contacting my planner. He didn't mention calling our wedding little. By the next afternoon, I wasn't a bride anymore. I was a rumor. Mom began sending individual messages. Please call me before this gets worse. Your father hasn't slept. Money isn't worth destroying a family. Please don't embarrass us by telling people private family business. That last message made something settle inside me. She wasn't worried about the family breaking. She was worried about people hearing why. I didn't respond. Instead, Daniel and I worked through the guest list. He circled duplicates and names we didn't recognize. I removed every person my parents had added without permission. We kept relatives we loved even if they disagreed with us. I wasn't trying to build an audience of supporters. I was trying to stop my wedding from becoming a reward system. Then Blake texted me. You don't deserve the kind of wedding I had if you can't respect Mom and Dad. I read it twice. Then I answered. Good thing I don't want your wedding. He replied almost immediately. Maybe stop making everything a statement. I took a screenshot and didn't answer again. Kelsey called later that night. I'm not getting involved, she began. You called me. I'm trying to help. Some brides make things harder than they need to be. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the thank you card still stacked on the dresser. How am I making it harder? Your wedding could still look nice if you let people help. It will look nice. You know what I mean. I do. She paused. Then she lowered her voice. Blake thinks you're jealous. Of what? The support he got. I almost laughed. Instead I said, did you know my parents offered us $12,000? That is still a lot of money. With 19 conditions. They wanted to be included. They wanted approval over my dress. Your mother has good taste. I ended the call. A few days later, Ruth asked me to come by. Ruth is my grandmother, 82, sharp-eyed, and quieter than most people in our family. She had attended Blake's wedding but left early because the band was too loud. She had congratulated us when we got engaged, pressed my hands between hers and said, choose the day you can live with afterward. When I arrived, she was sitting at her kitchen table with tea and a plate of shortbread cookies. She didn't ask about flowers or food. She said, your mother told me you refused your wedding money. I refused their contract. Ruth frowned. What contract? I showed her a photo of the first page and scrolled through the clauses. Her face changed while she read. Not shock exactly. Recognition. She set my phone down carefully. Did your father ever give you the wedding money I set aside? I thought I had misheard her. What wedding money? Ruth looked toward the window. Then she said, I gave Richard $42,000 for you. Years ago. The room seemed to narrow. For me. For your future wedding or your first home. Whichever came first. When? Before Blake got married. I stared at her. She stood slowly, went to a cabinet, and pulled out an old envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a cashier's check. Paid to the order of Richard. Amount, $42,000. The memo line read, Mia wedding/home. There was also a notarized letter. It stated that the money was intended solely for my future wedding or first home, and that my father was to hold it until I needed it. My name appeared 6 times. I read every line. Why did you give it to Dad? Because he was your father, Ruth said. I trusted him to keep it safe. Did you ever ask him about it? Once after Blake's wedding. He said it was invested and would be available when you needed it. My hands went cold. Why didn't you tell me? I thought he had. I looked at the check again. Ruth sat across from me and said, I trusted him because he was your father. That was my mistake. I wanted to call Dad immediately. I wanted to call Mom, Blake, Aunt Rose, everyone who had accused me of rejecting family love. I wanted to send the check copy to the entire family with one sentence. Ask them where this went. Instead, I called Daniel. He arrived 20 minutes later. He read the letter once, then again. Do you believe it? I asked. I believe Ruth gave him the money. That's not what I mean. He knew. Do I believe your parents used it? Yes. I think we should verify everything we can. Part of me hated that answer because I wanted certainty. I wanted anger clean enough to stand on. But he was right. Ruth gave us copies. The next morning, I asked her bank for any available records attached to the old check. Because it was her account, she made the request. We confirmed the check had been deposited into an account controlled by my father several months before Blake's wedding. That didn't prove where it went. So I kept looking. My mother had once sent me digital copies of family financial records when she needed help locating a tax document. I still had access to the old shared archive. I didn't dig through their current accounts or break into anything. I searched only files that had been sent to me. There were vendor invoices from Blake's wedding. The venue's final payment schedule showed several major additions during the last 8 weeks before the ceremony. Upgraded floral installations. Open bar extension. Additional rehearsal dinner charges. A honeymoon contribution. The extra costs totaled a little over $31,000. The payment dates lined up almost exactly with transfers from the account where Ruth's check had been deposited. Then I found an old text export in a document Mom had saved. It was a conversation between her and Dad. Linda, we're too far in to cut anything now. Kelsey will notice. Richard, I'll cover the difference from the family account. Linda, what about Mia's portion? Richard, we'll replace it before she needs it. Linda, if Mia ever asks, we say we helped both kids as much as we could. I stopped breathing for a second. Daniel was sitting beside me at the kitchen table. Receipts, printed invoices, and the notarized letter were spread between us. He read the messages. Then he leaned back and rubbed both hands over his face. That's it, I said. Yes. They knew. Yes. They used money Ruth gave me, spent most of it on Blake's wedding, and now they're offering me $12,000 if I let them control mine. Yes. The worst part wasn't that they had lied. It was how neatly the lie had been filed into our family story. Blake had received more because he deserved a larger celebration. I was receiving less because I was difficult. My parents were generous. I was ungrateful. Every piece fit as long as nobody looked underneath it. I stood so quickly my chair scraped the floor. I'm calling them. Daniel looked up. You can. I'm calling everyone. You can. I grabbed my phone. Then he said, but you don't have to prove it tonight. I stopped. He wasn't telling me to calm down. He wasn't asking me to forgive them. He was reminding me that I didn't have to hand them my anger before I had decided what to do with it. I put the phone down. No, I said. But when I do, nobody gets to pretend they misunderstood. We spent the next several days building a timeline. Ruth's check and notarized letter. The deposit date. The wedding invoices. The payment schedule. Mom's message. The 19-rule agreement. Dad's vendor interference. The family email. Blake's text. Mom's request that I not embarrass them with private family business. I spoke briefly with an attorney recommended by a friend. I didn't want a courtroom drama during my wedding week. I wanted to understand what a reasonable written demand would look like and whether Ruth's notarized letter mattered. The attorney explained that the documentation was significant, but recovering money through formal litigation could become slow, expensive, and ugly. He suggested beginning with a written demand for repayment and preserving every record. That was enough for me. I wasn't trying to send my father to court before my wedding. I wanted him to stop calling theft generosity. While I gathered the evidence, I changed the wedding. Not to punish them. To remove the access they had used to punish me. My parents' names came off the invitations as hosts. Blake's speech came out of the reception program. The unauthorized guests were removed. Dad and Mom were moved from the honor table to a regular family table. Ruth was placed in the honor seat beside the one chair I left empty. Daniel saw the seating chart proof when it arrived from the printer. Do you want the empty chair? He asked. Yes. For symbolism? Partly. And partly. I'm tired of filling every space they leave and pretending it was my choice. He studied the chart, then nodded. At first, I had planned to leave my father's seat at the honor table empty because I wasn't sure he would attend. By the time the chart was finalized, the chair meant something else. It represented the role he believed money had purchased. I left the space empty because I was done letting controls sit there. My parents learned about the seating arrangement when Mom saw an early reception proof that had been emailed to a family member helping with place cards. She called me 12 times. I answered on the 13th. You seated us at table 9, she said. Yes. With your cousins. Yes. Your grandmother is at the honor table. Yes. And there is an empty chair. Yes. Her voice became very soft. You are breaking your father's heart over a seating chart. No. The seating chart reflects what already happened. All we wanted was to be included. No. You wanted control and called it inclusion. She inhaled sharply. This is not how family treats each other. I agree. For once she had no immediate answer. Then she said, please do not do anything at the rehearsal dinner. People are already uncomfortable. I looked at the copies on my desk. Then Dad shouldn't give them another false version. Mia. I mean it. He is your father. And Ruth's letter says the money was mine. Silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. That was the moment I knew Mom had no intention of denying she knew. She only said, this is more complicated than you understand. No, it's more embarrassing than you expected. She hung up. The rehearsal dinner took place 2 nights before the wedding. Daniel and I almost canceled it, but too many relatives had already traveled, and we didn't want every event surrounding our marriage to be defined by my parents. We kept it simple. When we arrived, Dad was already moving through the room like a host. He shook hands, pulled out chairs, and asked people about their flights. Mom wore the expression of someone attending a funeral she had organized herself. Blake and Kelsey sat near the center of the longest table. Ruth arrived with Aunt Rose. Rose hugged me, but it was stiff. I hope tonight can be peaceful, she said. So do I. Daniel squeezed my hand once under the table. Dinner began normally. People talked about weather, travel delays, and who had forgotten to pack formal shoes. A cousin knocked over a water glass. Someone made a joke about Daniel's careful rehearsal schedule. For 20 minutes, I almost believed we might get through the evening. Then Dad stood with a wineglass. Daniel looked at me. I saw the question in his face. Do you want me to stop him? I shook my head. Dad smiled around the room. I know traditionally the groom's family might speak first, he began, but I wanted to say something about sacrifice. My stomach tightened. He continued. Parents give everything they can to their children. Time, money, patience, opportunities. We do it without expecting repayment. But as children become adults, sometimes they forget what was given. Sometimes outside influences convince them that family guidance is control. Several people looked at Daniel. He didn't move. Dad went on. A parent can give everything, and sometimes a child still decides it isn't enough. Mom lowered her eyes and touched a napkin to one corner. Blake stared at the table with the solemn expression of a man enjoying someone else's humiliation while pretending not to. Dad raised his glass. Still, family is family. We remain ready to forgive. The room was quiet. Then Mom said, just loudly enough to carry. All we wanted was to be included. Aunt Rose looked at me. Mia, why are you doing this? That was the opening my parents had created. So I used it. I stood. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't. Since everyone is judging me based on one version, I'm going to correct the record once. Dad's face changed. Mia, he warned. No. You chose to make this public. This is not appropriate. Neither was your toast. Daniel reached beside his chair and handed me the stack of envelopes we had brought. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He simply placed the evidence in my hands. I passed one envelope to Aunt Rose and another to Ruth. Daniel passed copies down both sides of the table. Dad set his glass down. What is this? The part you left out. The first page was the funding agreement. I read several clauses aloud. Parental approval of the guest list. Parental approval of the dress. Parental control over the seating chart. Mandatory host credit. Blake's guaranteed speech. Dad's authority over disputes. Then I held up the last page. You told everyone I rejected your help. You left out the part where your help came with 19 rules and my silence. Mom said. That was only a draft. It had Dad's initials on every page. We were trying to avoid conflict, Dad said. You contacted my planner before I agreed to anything. I asked questions. The vendor email is behind the contract. Pages shifted around the table. Aunt Rose read quickly. Someone farther down whispered. He called the planner? I continued. When I refused the agreement, Dad sent a family email saying Daniel and I had cut them out. Mom texted me asking me not to embarrass them by discussing private family business. Blake told me I did not deserve a wedding like his. Blake pushed back from the table. That was a private text. So was the money. The room went still. Ruth's notarized letter was the next page. I held up the copy of the check. Before Blake's wedding, Ruth gave Dad $42,000 for my future wedding or first home. The memo line says my name. The notarized letter says the money was intended for me alone. Kelsey looked at Blake. Blake looked at Dad. I laid out the invoices, not every page, only the ones that mattered. The check was deposited several months before Blake's wedding. During the final weeks of his wedding planning, more than $31,000 in added charges appeared, floral upgrades, an extended open bar rehearsal dinner additions, and part of the honeymoon. The payments line up with transfers from the same account. Blake shook his head. That was family money. No, I said. It became family money after it stopped being mine. I didn't know it was yours. You knew the wedding went over budget. Everyone knew that. You knew Mom and Dad covered it with money they had not planned to spend. That doesn't mean I knew where it came from. No, but it means you knew enough to stop acting like you earned everything and I was asking for too much. Kelsey's face had gone pale. She said, we didn't ask them to take anything from you. You asked for upgrades after the budget was gone. That is not the same thing. No, it isn't. They made the decision. You benefited from it. The problem is that all four of you spent weeks telling everyone I was selfish without asking one honest question. Dad stepped forward. This is not how adults handle private matters. I looked at him. You made it public when you emailed the family. You made it public again with that toast. You have no idea how much we sacrificed. I know exactly what you sacrificed. Mine. Mom started crying then. Not loudly. She pressed both hands around her napkin and said, "We always planned to replace it. When? We would have. When? We offered you $12,000. With a contract. You refused it. It was already mine." Dad's jaw tightened. The money was entrusted to me. I made a decision for the family. Ruth's voice cut through the room. No, Richard. I made the decision when I wrote the check. He turned toward her. She didn't raise her voice. I gave that money to Mia. I trusted you to hold it. I did not give you permission to spend it on Blake. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. Aunt Rose had reached Mom's saved text exchange. She read it silently. Then she looked at Dad. Richard, did you use money meant for Mia on Blake's wedding? Dad's face had gone red. It wasn't that simple. Rose didn't look away. Did you? He said nothing. That silence did more than a confession could have. Mom began crying harder. Blake muttered, "This is unbelievable." I looked at him. Which part? That you planned this. I documented it. You ambushed us. Dad stood up and called me ungrateful in front of the family. You could have handled it privately. I tried to handle the wedding privately. You all kept inviting an audience. Aunt Rose lowered the papers. I thought you were being ungrateful, she said to me. I need to say that out loud because I was wrong. Not everyone apologized. One uncle stared at his plate. A cousin whispered something to her husband. Kelsey folded the documents back into the envelope as if neatness could distance her from them. Mom kept saying, "We were going to replace it," but each repetition sounded weaker. Dad finally said, "What exactly do you want?" That question told me more than any apology would have. Not what did we do? Not how can we repair this? What do you want? A transaction. Fine. I had prepared for one. I want a signed repayment agreement for the money Ruth gave me, minus any amount you can prove was spent directly for my benefit. I want a written correction sent to every relative who received your email. I want confirmation that neither of you will contact our vendors again. Blake will not give a speech. You and Mom will attend as regular guests, not hosts. And you will sit at table 9. Mom looked up sharply. You're still humiliating us. No. I'm removing the honor you tried to purchase with my own money. Dad's voice dropped. And if I refuse? Then you do not attend, and I move forward with the options I discussed with counsel. The word counsel changed him. He stared at me for a long moment. You spoke to a lawyer? I asked what the documents meant. Mom looked horrified. You would sue your parents? I asked for repayment. What happens next depends on you. Ruth folded her hands on the table. Mia doesn't owe silence to people who took from her. Nobody finished dessert. The next morning, Dad emailed me a repayment proposal. It wasn't an apology. It was a spreadsheet. He tried to deduct vague family expenses from the amount, including vacations, birthday gifts, and college costs that had nothing to do with Ruth's money. I rejected it. Daniel reviewed the numbers with me and said, "He's trying to turn parenting into an invoice." I know. We sent back a simple schedule for the full remaining amount, with dates and signatures. Dad argued twice. Then Ruth told him she would provide a sworn statement if necessary. He signed. Mom sent a separate apology. It began well. We should have told you about Ruth's gift. Then it became defensive. We were under pressure during Blake's wedding. We truly believed we could restore the money. We never intended to hurt you. We only wanted your wedding to reflect the family well. At the end she wrote, I am sorry you felt controlled. I responded, I did not feel controlled. You presented 19 written conditions, contacted my vendor, and hid money meant for me. I will accept your acknowledgement when it describes what you did without changing it into my emotional reaction. 6 hours later, she sent another message. You are right. We controlled the wedding planning, hid Ruth's gift, and used money meant for you. I am sorry. It wasn't warm. It wasn't complete. But it was accurate. Dad sent a correction to the relatives he had emailed. He wrote that his original message had omitted important financial and planning details, that my refusal of the $12,000 was based on conditions attached to it, and that money intended for me had been used elsewhere without my knowledge. He didn't use the word wrong. Aunt Rose replied to the thread anyway. Mia was misrepresented. I saw the documents. Richard and Linda owe her more than a correction. Several relatives called me after that. Some apologized. Some said they didn't want to take sides. One uncle told me that exposing the truth at dinner was understandable but unfortunate, which sounded like the family version of admitting I was right while protecting himself from discomfort. I stopped trying to collect perfect reactions. That was another form of waiting for permission. The day before the wedding, Mom called and asked whether the empty chair would still be at the honor table. Yes. People will talk. They already have. What am I supposed to say when they ask why your father isn't sitting there? The truth is available. She was quiet. Then she asked, "Do you still want us at the wedding?" I thought about it before answering. I'm allowing you to attend because you signed the repayment terms, corrected the story, and acknowledged what happened. That is not the same as everything being repaired. I know. No speeches. No vendor contact. No changes. No scenes. I understand. And if Dad says anything about sacrifice, family loyalty, or Daniel dividing us, you both leave. I understand. She sounded smaller than usual. I didn't enjoy that. That surprised me. For months I had imagined what it would feel like to make my parents face consequences. I thought there would be satisfaction in hearing Mom lose control of the conversation. There was some. But mostly there was grief. I wasn't grieving the money. We would recover it over time. I was grieving the version of my parents I had kept defending long after the evidence changed. The wedding morning was quiet. My dress hung near the window. The thank you cards were still sitting in a box on the counter because, despite everything, I had not finished alphabetizing them. Ruth arrived early. She wore a deep blue dress and carried the old handkerchief she had brought to every family wedding for decades. When she saw the honor table place card with her name, she touched it with 2 fingers. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I wanted to." She looked at the empty seat. "Is that for your father?" "No." She waited. "It's for the part of my life I kept reserving for his approval." Ruth nodded once. "That takes up a lot of room." It did. Daniel and I married in the ceremony we had planned. The flowers were simpler than the first proposal. The dinner had fewer choices than Mom wanted. The photographer didn't have an international award or a waiting list. None of it mattered. When the music started, I realized I could breathe. That was the detail I remember most. Not the dress. Not the vows, though I remember those too. Breathing. Nobody was waiting to correct me. Nobody had a clipboard of conditions. Nobody was about to announce that my choices reflected badly on the family. Dad and Mom arrived on time and sat at table 9. Dad looked at the honor table once, then looked away. Mom cried during the ceremony, but she didn't make it about herself. She hugged me afterward and said, "You look beautiful." I said, "Thank you." That was all. Blake and Kelsey attended too. Blake didn't give a speech. He avoided me until late in the reception, when he found me near the hallway outside the ballroom. "I really didn't know it was your money," he said. "I believe you didn't know exactly." He flinched at the wording. "But you knew Mom and Dad went over budget for you," I continued. "You knew they treated your wants like family needs. And when I refused their conditions, you did not ask why. You told me I didn't deserve what you had." He looked down. I was angry. "You were comfortable." He didn't answer. "I'm not asking you to give me back your wedding," I said. "I'm asking you to stop pretending you had nothing to do with the system that paid for it." Kelsey appeared behind him. She said, "We are sorry." It sounded rehearsed. Maybe it was. I nodded and returned to the reception. I didn't need the apology to be perfect before I walked away. The repayment began the following month. Dad made the first payment on time. Then the second. Our relationship became formal. He emailed before calling. Mom stopped offering suggestions unless I asked. Family dinners were less frequent and more careful. Some people would call that sad. It was. It was also peaceful. I didn't cut my parents out completely. I cut out their unrestricted access. They could be present without being in charge. They could speak without rewriting events. They could rebuild trust, but they could not demand credit for work they had not done. Ruth's chair stayed at the honor table all night. The other chair remained empty. People noticed. Few asked. Most did not. I had once believed an empty chair meant someone was missing. By the end of that night, I understood it could also mean something had finally been removed. My parents thought paying for a wedding meant buying a daughter. I finally showed them I was never for sale. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.